So it's not January 26th when this is uploaded. I guess see this as my change for date statement, if you want. Anyway, 10 Canoes. Sir Rolf de Heer is not someone I would have held in the highest esteem until this work arrives in his oeuvre. Well, partly. I find his prior career hit or miss, and I feel it is extremely important to note that this film has a co-director credit, Peter Djigirr, who, reading this sentence aloud from the Bula Bula Arts website, Peter Djigirr is a Jinba man from the Arafura swamp. He is a guru whaling ranger from the southeast Arafura catchment, close to his traditional tribal lands. This would be Peter's only directorial credit, although it's safe to say that Peter's perspective is inevitably insurmountably influential on the final work. So apparently at the time, De Heer, according to him at least, received some criticism for being a white director telling an indigenous story, rather than a story told by the indigenous, and thus wasn't truly, authentically, an indigenous film. De Heer's claim was, according to this Wikipedia article which cites a print magazine interview, they're telling the story, largely, and I'm the mechanism by which they can. I would propose that Peter Djigirr's co-director credit is a means via which this film can initially claim a degree of credibility at just the surface level. I feel that De Heer ought to have given someone a co-writer credit, as I'm sure he didn't translate his script, which rereaders as English subtitles, I would assume, into Yolngu Matha, although maybe this was a union issue, I don't know. Maybe there's something more going on there. It is a potentially valid criticism, though, a white Australian utilising a certain mythologization or aestheticization of the indigenous Australians, which is created and sold to white Australians in order to make another film for white Australians. This is especially compounded by the fact that the initial theatrical release featured an English language narrator discussing the events of a tribe-speaking Yolngu Matha rather than the Yolngu Matha narrator, which spoke over the copy I recently had viewed. Subtitles for English language speakers is more than enough. It breaks the immersion with an English language narrator, feels a bit too condescending, or even worse. To my understanding, most or all home video distribution of 10 Canoes features the Yolngu Matha narrator. At the end of the day, though, I do feel like this was a conscious attempt by De Heer to tell an indigenous story and enable them, sponsor them, because unfortunately, the Australian government will nerf or underfund or underpromote any attempts by the indigenous to compose media of their own. I know there are seemingly lots of examples of indigenous Australians being granted the funds to record music, produce TV shows, or compose a minor independent art/festival film, though they are only pushed and marketed toward a very specific group or demographic, the indigenous themselves, not placed in as part of the general discourse of art overall, it seems to me. Now, maybe I'm not appreciating that they are directed toward a specific community and not the wider culture or market, and is preferred by the indigenous parties that way. That is fine. But I do feel as though there is an implication that indigenous art and media is not to be taken as seriously by the wider consumer culture, and I suspect that maybe logistically they aren't being given the funds that major works of this country's cultural output are given. No one can produce anything in this country artistically without extensive government funding. It is rarely given out to anyone, especially in this century apparently, and so rare as it is, I certainly don't notice it amongst the indigenous in artistic output. The only examples tend to be projects spearheaded, still, by Rolf de Heer, to which Peter sometimes serves as a producer for. The point is I'm trying to make is that Rolf de Heer, already an established influential figure in Australian art, was a necessary mechanism, if nothing else, logistically, politically, economically. There may very well be a systemic issue which represses the composition of well-financed Indigenous art. Though that being said, the 2022 Vivid Opera House display, a motion-animated recreation of Indigenous art composed by the Pangur community, may be an even better example of what De Heer has been attempting. You may have noted, some of this film is shot in black and white. Now, why is that? Render any subject of any time period, any part of the world, in black and white, and it all exists on the same plane of perpetual modesty and human understanding. Colour expunges, potentially, the more flat-lined anthropological equalization which a black and white depiction can create, and so I suspect that De Heer wanted to experiment with this photographic sheen in order to examine the psychological response to the images. There was a different way of thinking associated with viewing black and white photography versus the later colour photography. The black and white standard was democratizing. It did not romanticize or overtly trigger a sense of specificity to the viewer, the black and white photographing of others was pure human data, a visual metaphor for clinical text. The colour photograph, conversely, was a window into aesthetics, a qualitative, subjective display of a culture's distinct priorities or environmental preferences, circumstances, lifestyles. Whether this was how Djigirr thought about it, I don't know, but he inspired me to consider this, if nothing else, so. I am happy for 10 Canoes because if it does no other good politically, culturally, it can exist to inform the international audience of the Indigenous Australian experience, which they might not otherwise, not living here to access education, resources, or individuals to learn from. Also, of course, it is a superlative act of film direction, cinematography, visual storytelling, editing, and of sound design. Though what good might any of that be if the film was more a fetishization or exploitation of Indigenous cultures and ways of life for the sake of upper-class white Australian leisurely pseudo-enlightenment? Well, you see, times have changed from the year 2006, from the 2000s in general, frankly. Now we live in a world where the most important thing in the discourse is the rhetoric of the text itself. Not empiricism, not real-world application, but the discourse in and of itself, and how it manifests as vague witticisms on social media platforms. In 2006, the discourse could only exist in conversations in the real world, and one expected the discourse to be taking place was preparing their thoughts to be shared in a classroom context. If you had ideas to do with politics, the arts, or future speculation, it wasn't an abstract wank into the hyperstition-esque theory for its own sake, so often abundant in a lot of left-wing discourse online today, a political cause I strongly believe in, for the clarification. It was an attempt to translate ideas into an active execution within the real world, for outside. 10 Canoes wasn't composed of the abstract Twitter, X discourse for its own sake, character as currency in mind. It was intended for conversations to be had in the real world, which might have had an effect on tangible factors in this real world, the outside. 10 Canoes made me realize again how very different this world was before social media cyberspace, and how social media itself really stifled what appeared to be a potential Arcadia of discourse and practical progressivism. Any discourse now is dominated by attempted influences on social media, careerist hacks, and those who feel as though appeasing them is the begrudging way forward, though maybe well-intentioned appeasers, in fairness. If we weren't so distracted by a superficial online popularity contest, maybe there wouldn't have been so many obnoxious voices which enabled, for one thing, the losing of the yes vote, which is at least as much the fault of the more elitist ABC or social media influencer wing of the yes campaign than of Dutton's goons in the no campaign. I don't inherently disrespect those who participated in the no campaign or otherwise voted that way. I understand they preferred a measure or measures which didn't require the changing of the country's constitution. I do feel as though they were overly demonised, but by the parties I mentioned, and it was this elitism and snobbery which alienated the average Australian. And for that, frankly, the poison which social media inflicted upon our societies, turning the virtuous struggle into a popularity contest, commodifying culture and social behaviour, allowing others to express things entirely for the sake of appearances, nay, encouraging this as a more valid way of life than a sense of authenticity, all enabled what I would describe as a ruination, or the ruination, of public discourse. So what do we do to fix it? Nothing. It has been killed forever. An exodus from social media, but the younger generations have been conditioned into wanting nothing more than to be accepted and popular on social media, even ones who claim otherwise, in my observations. Everything you think, consider how one would explain it to someone else, outside, in the real world. The internet makes it too easy to pretend, too easy to care far more about coming across than being oneself, makes people more concerned with how they are perceived in the third person than right or wrong, indeed creating the perception that caring about what others think is a more noble pursuit than following one's own conscience. Horrific. We need to go back outside, eventually. Oh, to fix a discourse, well, I am trying to shift the film discourse into one which more resembles the writings and philosophy of Noel Oakeshott, which I share and which has been supremely influential on my own beliefs as a filmmaker and as some jerk with opinions about films and art and culture and the wider discourse generally. Sometimes I think the least we can do is place films such as 10 Canoes at the top of our film canon domestically, not only because it deserves the title, obviously, but because it is the most important story, truly, of this continent. The story of her true, original custodians.